24. The floor is now open for discussion. Senator Chambers, followed by Senator Loudon, Senator Persh. Senator Chambers.
Mr. President, members of the legislature, I support the amendment, I support the bill, and I applaud Senator Shimmick and the others who have signed on the bill, those members of the Judiciary Committee who worked hard to bring us to the point where we are now and special ordered it. But he will, based on my understanding, order that it be expedited, which means it will not plod through the process as ordinarily is done, but as quickly as possible will be processed so we can move it right across the floor. But to acknowledge the good job done by Senator Ashford and Senator Shimmick in laying out the technical aspects of the law, the amendment, and some of the factual background in this case, but I want to talk about it also. Under the existing treaty, if a state, meaning not just America but any other country, has a child custody law which violates certain standards or rights or principles, then a court in Nebraska can disregard an order of that foreign court. But since there is nothing in Canada's laws related to child custody which violate that principle standing alone would not justify the Nebraska court in disregarding the order of the Canadian court, even though we're dealing with the case of a child where credible evidence was established and adduced that abuse is taking place. So what the amendment will do is tie into that general provision and not base it only on whether the court, that country's laws are inappropriate, but if you have the case of a child who is subject to abuse or the threat of abuse, when that is established by credible evidence, then a new basis for disregarding the foreign court order is brought into being, and that's what this amendment will do. There will have to be hearings, and in this case, last year, Judge Merritt held what's called an evidentiary hearing. Both sides were represented by counsel. There were psychologists present who had treated, diagnosed, and worked with the child and had reached the conclusion that she had been victimized and it would not be in her best interest to be returned to the environment in Canada where she would be in the custody of the person who had created the abuse. So, the reason it is necessary for us to act with dispatch is because under Nebraska law, when a judge, as Judge Merritt did, will enter a temporary emergency order to prevent the child from being returned to that foreign country, he is required by Nebraska law to immediately notify the foreign court which has jurisdiction of the case. Judge Merritt attempted to do this, but under Canadian law, there is no basis, there is nothing in Canadian law that authorizes a Canadian judge to participate in such a conference, so that judge who had jurisdiction of the case did not communicate with Judge Merritt, so that part of Nebraska law cannot be complied with because the Canadian law prevents, through its non-providing of a means to do this, that conference from taking place. Judge Merritt is a careful, meticulous jurist. He has not bent the law, stretched the law, or in any other way tilted this case to favor the parent who lives in Nebraska. And as a matter of fact, if the Nebraska legislature were not to act with due expeditiousness, that Canadian court could convene a hearing, rule that everything is as it should be, that the child has to be returned so that the father will have his parenting rights and the child is gone back to that bad situation. We must act, and by doing this, I'll complete when I turn on my light again. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Loudon first.
Mr. President, members of the legislature, because this issue is such an important one, and Nebraska is cutting new ground on very firm footings, I want the record to be clear that we knew what we were doing and that we had a valid reason as a legislature to do what we're doing. When we enact this proposal into law, we are not ordering any court to do anything. This has no bearing on the underlying dispute between the mother and the father. It does not resolve the issue of whether there is abuse sufficient to justify a Nebraska court in ignoring the order of a Canadian court. All that it does is give a basis for a Nebraska court to review the evidence in the case pertaining to a given child. And if that evidence establishes that that child has been subjected to abuse or is in danger of being subjected to abuse, that Nebraska court can then disregard the order of a foreign court to send that child back to that foreign jurisdiction. In other words, the Nebraska court can then substitute its judgment for that of the foreign court. So all we're doing is creating a set of circumstances where when a Nebraska court makes the findings that Judge Merritt made after interviewing the affected parties, including the child, when that judge arrives at the conclusion that this child is in danger, that judge here can then disregard the order from the foreign court that said bring her back. Without this law, if Judge Merritt wanted to keep her here because it has been established that she's subject to abuse, he could not do so. International law, the law of Nebraska, which complies with that international law, ties his hands, and he cannot keep her here. He could cry with her all the way to the airport and cry bitter tears until the plane disappears into the distance, but it would mean nothing because there is no basis for him under the law to disregard that foreign order. All we're doing is putting him in a position to handle this case as it should be handled on the basis of the evidence. And the reason I am, to borrow a word from my new young colleague, Senator Persh, the reason I am belaboring this point and these issues is so that if anybody has any question about any part of this bill or why we're doing it, you should ask those questions so that they can be answered, and they will help make the record complete if you feel it is not complete at this time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers. Senator Ingle, followed by Senator... Thank you. The floor is now open for discussion on LB 341. Senator Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the legislature, Senator Ashford mentioned the service performed by Senator Lathrop in his comments, and I just want to underscore them. If a complex law is enacted, if it is one which other states agree to, if it is embodied in an international treaty, and it rocks along for years and years, there is no reason for anybody to examine it and speculate about possible problems that could develop. But when a problem does develop, it brings to everybody's attention the fact that there is a gap existing in the law, and the gap should be plugged. Just as a tire on an 18-wheel rig, if it got a hole in it which allowed air to escape, that tire would go flat, no matter how big it is, no matter how powerful the rig. So you don't always have to have a nuclear strike against a law to show that there's a problem with it and a need to correct it. This places Nebraska in the forefront of improving a law which nobody up to this point realized was inadequate. So Senator Lathrop really did a great service this morning, and I hope what he did and what other new senators are doing will encourage everybody who has a comment to offer on any subject before us will do so. Every senator here, whether you just got here, you just hatched out of the egg, or you've been here as long as I have and are deemed to be returning to the status mentally of one who just hatched out of the egg. You have as much legitimacy as I or anybody else has who's been here a long time. Your constituents sent you here to do a job. You're entitled to express any view that you choose on the floor in any way you think is necessary to make your point. You're free to take issue with any person, with anything any person says. We are a glorified, although we don't get glory, debating society. And it is glorified because we don't just talk and then somebody is ruled by a third party to have won the argument. Often, our talk will result in the enactment of legislation, in the repealing of legislation. So very important consequences flow from what it is that we do. And when our work finds its way into the statute books, that work is not reviewed just by people in this state. Lawmakers in other states, maybe even in other countries in view of the issue being addressed here today, will look at what the legislature did. I think the debate was on a very high level. It was informative. Senator Shimmick prepared the way. Then Senator Ashford, wearing those little slippers that ballet or ballerinas use so that he won't disturb anything, traipsed across that red carpet of explanation that Senator Shimmick gave. And as a result, we have before us something that I believe everybody understands in its broad outlines. And if you have any specific questions, they can be brought up as we move. But since the Speaker has indicated that he's going to order this bill expedited, you must speak now. And that now includes while we're dealing with this bill, or forever hold your peace insofar as what you're saying having anything to do with affecting this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Chambers.